apropos the movement that is happening in many state legislatures in the United States right now to limit the ability of children to medically and surgically transition. And specifically, the state of Arkansas was the first to do this a couple of weeks ago, and the ACLU, and what is becoming its generic, knee-jerk, frankly uninvestigated stance, said, trans youth will be denied health care. And it made it seem like all healthcare, like if you show up with a broken arm and you're trans and you're 16, you would not get your arm set, which of course is not true. And so I mocked the ACLU, as has become the thing that I do on Twitter, by rephrasing their what they said accurately. And actually, maybe I'll just show this or read this. What I said was, the ACLU said, breaking, Arkansas has become the first state to ban healthcare for trans youth. I quote tweeted them and said, breaking, Arkansas has become the first state to ban gender transition procedures in people under 18, and the ACLU has become the first organization to wildly misrepresent what has happened. Someone, and you don't need to show this, Zach, but someone with a fancy PhD and a lab of their own said, quote tweeting me and thinking, I think, that he had schooled me, gender dysphoria can start around 7 years old and includes a link, and in fact includes 3 links, and I could tear all of them apart, but I'm just going to talk about one of them and what it led me to think about here. So the first paper that he links to, is this one. You can just show this quickly. This is a research letter in JAMA Network Open, published last year by several authors, called Age at First Experience of Gender Dysphoria Among Transgender Adults Seeking Gender-Affirming Surgery. Okay, so that's it. And I looked through it, and it does indeed find, assuming that it's doing an accurate job of describing what it was looking at, that some people who transition later in life start saying that they are trans at a very young age. Okay.
Yep.
I believe that. I mean, I would be shocked if that weren't true. In fact,
it has to be true.
It has to be true, right? So the missing piece of the research, though, the idea that research is in any way a rebuttal to my implied claim in what I tweeted, and I'm going to talk explicitly about what my implied claim is here. The thing that is missing from that as an argument against giving medical and surgical intervention to children is how many children who do not later transition say the same thing. And we, in fact, have probably no way of knowing that. I would love those data. I would love to know. And we would basically have to survey widely across all children and ask parents, did your child ever say something like, I'm a boy or I'm a girl, and it wasn't their natal sex? Or did they dress up in mom, did you find the boy in mom's heels one day? And, any number of sort of gender nonconforming things that are now taken as evidence of transness. And absent that, absent knowing how many people, and I will posit that I am certain, but I do not have the data, and I don't think it's possible to get the data again, that a much larger number of children, of course, make such claims because make-believe and playing with identity and exploration is exactly what childhood is about. So the fact that some people who do later transition make claims early on is not evidence that we need to be supporting their transitions medically and surgically, and here's why. I would ask, which error does society prefer that we make? Should we intervene at an early age with experimental and known to be unsafe medical and surgical interventions such that a large number of non-trans adults are mutilated, both physically and mentally, for life? Or should we fail to intervene at an early age with experimental and known to be unsafe medical and surgical interventions such that a tiny number of actual trans adults come to be a slightly less good fit for their internally perceived gender? So we can use the language of statistics here, I think, quite usefully. And some people will actually be better able to make sense of the landscape this way. And certainly people like this professor who thought that he had made a killing blow at my argument should be able to do this kind of logic. This is going to be the language of null and alternative hypotheses and the kinds of errors that can result, that is to say type 1 and type 2 errors. So the null hypothesis, which is also called the default hypothesis, in this case is that you are not trans. That if you are a child, the null hypothesis is that you're not trans. The alternative hypothesis is that you are. Why is the null hypothesis that you're not? 500 million years of uninterrupted sexual reproduction in human history and overwhelming evidence that a deeply felt disconnect between your actual sex and your perceived sex is extraordinarily rare. We have said on this podcast and elsewhere many, many times that we understand trans to be real and exceedingly rare, and that a majority of what is going on right now in the name of trans rights is not actually about actual transness. So the null hypothesis is you're not trans. Type 1 errors, when they occur, are that you have rejected the null hypothesis even though it is true, also known as a false positive. In this case, in the case that I am talking about here, you reject a type 1 error would be assuming that you are trans even though you're not. And the societal ramification of such a type 1 error would be encouraging transition even for those who do not turn out to warrant it or want it. Compare that to a type 2 error, which involves rejecting the alternative hypothesis even though it is true, also known as a false negative. Okay. In this case, the one that we're talking about right here, a type 2 error would be assuming that you are not trans, even though you in fact are. And the societal ramification would be, again, preventing people who do turn out to be trans from transitioning early in life. So given that, we've got two types of errors, type 1 errors and type 2 errors in this landscape of people who aren't trans and people who are trans, and we have childhood and a long period of development, and how can you know early on, and what should you do? Given that the background rate of trans people is exceedingly low, I think actually that it is our human societal responsibility to minimize type 1 errors in this case, to drive to as close to zero the number of healthy children harmed by medical and surgical intervention for two broad reasons. The sheer numbers of people who are going to be harmed by medical and surgical intervention is so much larger than those who are harmed by failing to surgically or medically intervene, fully aside from whether or not the medical or surgical intervention itself is a healthy thing to do. But just looking at the numbers of people who are and are not trans, the number of people who will be harmed by intervention when it was not called for is so much higher. And secondly, intervention, and to the later point, intervention in this functional ancient system, when no demonstration of the safety of that intervention has been made, goes against all that at least I understand to be moral and right and, in fact, just. For me, this is, in fact, a matter of justice. And I think that, in fact, reframing, trying to get the narrative back and reframing some of these issues is actually, who is on the side of social justice for populations like children and women is those of us who are saying you are redefining things and you are misunderstanding statistics, and you have taken a radically deficient data set to try to make a point in which you are actively harming people whom you have no right to harm.
Not only people that you have no right to harm, but we are talking about a population of kids who show some sign of dysphoria, right? That group presumably includes some trans people who will persist in their dysphoria, and it includes presumably many people whose dysphoria will clear up. We know that that's a common pattern. So the point is, actually, that group, kids with dysphoria, need protection from medicine that would surgically alter them, thereby eliminating their potential to reproduce as adults, risking their sexual functionality as adults. And so the point is, if you are interested in protecting kids with gender dysphoria, it is incumbent on you not to provide this surgery in light of the fact that that many of those kids will not grow up to be trans adults. And so by doing the study in such a way that you are looking through the lens of those people who were trans as adults, many of them believed they had just gender dysphoria as children, you are looking at the wrong data set, as you point out.
Exactly.
And it's simply, there's no justification for policy. Even those who ultimately go on to be trans as adults cannot have known that their gender dysphoria would be permanent as children. And in light of that, that group gender dysphoric kids needs protection so that they have the full range of options when they grow up.
Exactly. And, true gender dysphoria is a tiny subset of those people who are gender nonconforming. And gender nonconforming kids is a subset of children who are just exploring identity, right? And I would hope that actually all children are exploring identity. I would hope that is that sample is a perfect match for the population that is children. Some children aren't able to, or maybe they just don't explore, and certainly a lot of kids don't explore over in gender identity space. It's not inherently interesting to everyone, but the idea that all you have to have done is to be different from the societal norms, frankly, from the 1950s,
Right.
to, in some cases, be pushed into something that will permanently alter so much about your life should be criminal. And in fact, what we are seeing are these, once necessary powerhouse organizations like the ACLU, who are turning this on its head and who are defending the right, and therefore this steamrolling of modifying children for permanently. Because really, increasingly now we're finally seeing, but even as recently as a couple of years ago, people were still saying, well, there's no harm, just block them, just put them on puberty blockers, it'll be fine, and then that allow them to figure it out. It's like, well, if you're on puberty blockers, nothing about your development is now normal. There's no figuring things out as if things were going along normally at this point. But certainly you're going to have effects like, and we've gone through all of these, but physical, mental, psychological effects, fertility effects, all sexual function effects, all of these things.
So I don't know if you're where you were headed with this, but I do want to make clear why you and I both think it is inevitable that you will have some fraction of trans adults who experience gender dysphoria as kids, and why, therefore, we need to be very careful to draw any conclusion at all from the fact of that group existing, right? So in other words, it seems important. Well, if there are people who know that they're trans when they're young, then why not, get them on the road to whatever adult role they're going to play as quickly as possible? But here's the problem. Even if your gender conforming or non-conformity as a child and that same parameter as an adult were completely independent of each other, 100% independent, some small fraction of people would flip the coin the same unusual way twice. And so it is inevitable that you will have a group of adults, given that there are trans adults and given that there are there are dysphoric kids, some number of people will have been both, even if there were no implication whatsoever. And the fact is, there probably is some implication of your dysphoria as a child and dysphoria as an adult.
So of course there is. I mean, like, I get your point, and I think it's it's true. But I think, like, of course it's going to be a core. Of course, if you are a trans adult, you are more likely to have shown dysphoria as a child. But dysphoria and gender nonconformity are imprecisely and often inaccurately assigned. They are conflated, and there will be plenty of people with one or both who do not turn into being trans people as adults.
Right. Totally agree. The reason I'm highlighting this is that there's a Monty Hall problem buried in here, which is going to result in people, upon the discovery that some people apparently know from a very early age that they're trans, when that's not really what they know. They're dysphoric as young people, and it turns out that they, at the point that they are in a position to judge, are trans. But it does not have any implication whatsoever for how we should treat those young people, because it isn't, as long as the category of people who were dysphoric and don't go on to be trans as adults is a sizable fraction, they deserve protection, and you cannot act, especially in light of the fact that even if transition is more successful if you start early, right, it is still successful enough if somebody, upon reaching 18 or 20 years of age, says, yep, I'm trans. At that point, right, they still have options. And so protecting kids from permanent modifications, and as you point out, even the puberty blockers are permanent modifications because of the way they interface with development, it has to be prevented.